Before we dive in, let me leave you with a truth that echoes across every chapter in human history. Nothing we are began in silence. Every civilization, every story, every ancestor left a trail of wisdom waiting to be rediscovered. What you are about to hear is a part of a legacy, preserved, decoded, and brought back to the forefront. I'm OG Moonie. Welcome to AI Legacy Lab.
Before her name meant anything to science, Henrietta Lacks was simply a black woman trying to navigate a hard life in Jim Crow America. Imagine being born in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia, into a tobacco farming family. Survival didn't just mean physical strength. It meant a kind of deep, resilient silence. For so many black families of that era, the world didn't leave much space to dream, only space to endure. And yet, those who knew Henrietta remembered her warmth, a light she carried that lingered long after she left the room. It was a warmth she brought with her when she moved to Turner Station near Baltimore. There, she was a mother of 5, a wife, a friend, trying to hold her family together while the brutal lines of segregation carved limits around every single part of her existence. Think about that for a moment. Every store, every school, every water fountain was a reminder of a system designed to keep you down. So, when she started feeling a knot inside her, a persistent pain she couldn't ignore, her options were few. In 1951, she walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the only hospitals in the area that even allowed black patients through its doors. But walking through the door didn't mean she was safe. It didn't mean she was seen as a whole person. Behind the white coats and sterile equipment of that era lay a medical system that often viewed black bodies not as people with stories and rights, but as material for research, a resource to be used. The doctors found a tumor on her cervix. It was aggressive, fast-moving, a dark purple mass they described as being shaped like a thread. And in that moment, a decision was made that would echo through history. Without telling her, without a single word of explanation or asking for her permission, they cut a piece of that tumor. They took another sample from her healthy cervical tissue. They put them in a vial and sent them to a research lab. Why? Because in that era, for a black patient like Henrietta, consent was a luxury nobody thought she deserved. It simply wasn't part of the equation. Her body was considered a public good, available for the advancement of a science that had rarely served her or her community. While Henrietta began the painful, grueling process of radium treatments, fighting for her life with everything she had, something else was happening in a petri dish down the hall. Something miraculous, something scientists had been trying to achieve for decades without success. Every other human cell they had ever tried to grow in a lab had died within a few days. It was a fundamental rule of biology. But Henrietta's cells were different. They didn't die. They grew. They multiplied with an incredible, unstoppable force. They doubled their numbers every 24 hours, reaching for space in the dish as if they had their own mission, a life force that refused to be contained. The researchers were stunned. They froze, staring at what they had just discovered, the first immortal human cell line in history. They named it HeLa, using the first 2 letters of her first and last names. These cells could be frozen, shipped, and shared across the globe, creating a biological revolution. But Henrietta Lacks never heard those words. She never knew her body had just changed the future of medicine forever. She didn't know that pieces of her were alive, thriving in laboratories all over the world, even as her own body was failing her. She passed away just a few months later, at the young age of 31, buried in an unmarked grave. Her family didn't know what had been taken from her. For decades, they lived in poverty, struggling to afford basic health care, while the world built multi-billion-dollar industries on the life of a woman who never got to speak her own story. In the next part of this story, we'll step into what those cells became. We'll explore how HeLa cells were instrumental in developing the polio vaccine, in cancer research, in gene mapping, in cloning, and in understanding viruses like HIV. We'll uncover how the world built scientific and financial empires on this incredible gift, all while Henrietta's own family was kept in the dark. It's a story about scientific discovery, but it's also a story about justice, ethics, and the human cost of progress. It forces us to ask some really difficult questions. What is owed to the people whose bodies fuel medical breakthroughs? And how do we honor the legacy of a woman whose contribution was stolen before it was ever celebrated? As the story moves deeper into the shadows of what happened after Henrietta walked into Johns Hopkins, the truth becomes heavier. While she was being treated for her pain, the doctors were quietly studying the aggressive nature of her tumor. They noticed something unusual about the cells they removed, seeing that they divided with a speed and strength they had never witnessed before. Instead of dying in a few days like every other sample taken from every other patient, these cells kept multiplying as if they were refusing to obey the rules of biology. This discovery quietly spread through research rooms and laboratories as scientists realized they were watching something historic unfold. But the woman behind the cells was never asked for permission. She was never told what was being taken from her. Her cells grew so rapidly that they became the foundation for studying radiation effects, gene mapping, cancer behavior, polio vaccine development, and countless other medical breakthroughs that touched nearly every corner of modern science. Yet, while her cells traveled the world, her family struggled back home in Baltimore, not knowing that a part of her had been duplicated millions of times and shipped to institutions across the globe. Researchers were stunned that her cells could survive almost anything, including freezing, shipping, and experimental stress tests. This gave birth to the first Immortal cell line in human history. And while this opened the door to an entirely new era of medicine, it also exposed the deep ethical wounds at the core of American healthcare. Where a black woman's body could be used to advance the world while her own children live without healthcare or recognition. The more her cells spread, the larger the disconnect grew between the scientific triumph being celebrated and the quiet suffering of a family who had no idea that the mother they lost had become the backbone of an entire industry. This knowledge gap created a storm that would rise years later when her descendants finally learned the truth, setting the stage for a reckoning that science could no longer ignore. The story of Henrietta Lacks isn't just about a medical miracle. It's a human story about justice, identity, and the ethics of discovery. When Henrietta walked into that hospital, she was just a woman seeking help, a mother, a wife. She had no idea she was about to become a cornerstone of modern biology. The doctors, led by a researcher named George Gay, were fascinated. Normal human cells in a lab dish would divide a few dozen times and then die. It was a fundamental rule. But Henrietta's cells, which they nicknamed HeLa, just kept going. They were, for all intents and purposes, immortal. They doubled their population every 24 hours, an unstoppable biological force. This was the breakthrough scientists had been dreaming of for decades. Finally, they had a reliable, consistent, and endlessly regenerating supply of human cells to experiment on. Almost immediately, the HeLa cells were put to work. Jonas Salk used them to test his polio vaccine. Scientists exposed them to radiation to understand its effects on human tissue, which was critical during the Cold War era. They were sent into space to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. They were instrumental in mapping the human genome, understanding how viruses like HIV work, and developing treatments for diseases like Parkinson's, leukemia, and influenza. If you've ever benefited from a vaccine or modern medicine, there's a good chance HeLa cells played a role in its development. The impact is almost impossible to overstate. An entire industry was built on the back of these cells, generating billions of dollars and countless scientific careers. But through all of this, one crucial detail was consistently omitted: the human being they came from. For over 20 years, Henrietta's family had no idea. They grieved for their mother, who passed away just a few months after her diagnosis, and they tried to get by. They lived in poverty, often unable to afford the very medical care that their mother's cells were helping to revolutionize. Imagine the shock, the confusion, and the anger when, in the 1970s, they started getting calls from researchers. Scientists wanted to take blood samples from them to learn more about the genetics of the HeLa cells. It was then that the truth began to unravel. They learned that a piece of their mother was alive, bought and sold experimented on, and celebrated in labs all over the world, all without Gigi's consent or even their knowledge. It was as if she had been taken from them twice. This revelation opened the Pandora's box of ethical questions that the scientific community had long avoided. In the 1950s, the concept of informed consent was not what it is today, especially for Black patients in segregated hospitals. It was common practice for doctors to take tissue samples for research without asking. But the scale of what happened with Henrietta's cells was unprecedented. Her body, her genetic information, became a commercial product. Yet, her family saw no compensation. They weren't even given the courtesy of being told. This wasn't just a scientific oversight. It was a profound violation of a person and her family. The Lacks family found themselves in a surreal position. They were proud of their mother's unintentional contribution to science, but they were also deeply hurt by the way she and they had been treated. The story forced a global conversation. How much control should a person have over their own body parts once they're removed? Who owns your genetic information? And what does the medical establishment owe to the individuals whose bodies fuel its progress? The case of Henrietta Lacks became a central pillar in the bioethics movement. It led to new federal regulations, like the Common Rule, which now requires informed consent for all federally funded research involving human subjects. It highlighted the systemic racism embedded in medical research and the need for greater transparency and respect for patients, especially those from marginalized communities. The family's fight for recognition was not just for themselves, but for everyone. They fought to have their mother's name, her story, and her humanity restored to the narrative of HeLa. In the years since, the Lacks family has worked with institutions like the National Institutes of Health to gain some control over how their mother's genetic data is used. They've spoken at conferences and shared their story to ensure that this never happens to another family again. Author Rebecca Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, brought this incredible story to a global audience, cementing Henrietta's place in history, not just as a cell line, but as a woman whose legacy challenges us to think critically about the price of progress. Her cells continue to save lives and advance science every single day. But now, thanks to her family's fight, her story serves as a powerful reminder that behind every sample, every data point, and every medical breakthrough, there is a human being, and that humanity must never be forgotten. The legacy of Henrietta Lacks is a complex tapestry of scientific triumph and ethical failure. Her immortal cells represent one of the greatest gifts to medicine, a biological marvel that has saved countless lives and reshaped our understanding of the human body. Her story, however, represents a profound injustice, a story of a woman and her family who were left in the dark while her very essence was commercialized and distributed across the globe. It's a stark reminder that scientific advancement cannot be detached from human dignity. As we continue to push the boundaries of medicine and technology, we must carry Henrietta's lesson with us. We must ensure that progress serves humanity, without sacrificing the rights and respect of the individuals who make it possible. Her name, once lost to a lab coat, is now a symbol of both scientific miracle and the enduring fight for ethical justice in medicine. In 1951, Henrietta, a young Black mother of 5, walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital, the only major hospital in the area that treated Black patients. She had cervical cancer. During her radiation treatment, a surgeon took a sample of her tumor without her knowledge or consent. This was standard practice at the time, but what happened next was anything but standard. Henrietta's cells did something no other human cells had ever done before in a lab. They survived. They not only survived, they thrived, doubling every 24 hours. They were, for all intents and purposes, immortal. They were named HeLa, using the first 2 letters of her first and last names, and they became one of the most important tools in medical history. Henrietta Lacks passed away just a few months later. At the age of 31, she was buried in an unmarked grave. Her family grieved, completely unaware that a piece of her was still alive. And not just alive, but multiplying endlessly in labs all across the globe. For decades, The Lacks family lived in poverty, unable to afford health insurance, struggling to bury their own relatives. All while Henrietta's cells were fueling a medical revolution. HeLa cells were used to develop the polio vaccine. They helped scientists understand how viruses work, leading to treatments for herpes and influenza. They were fundamental in cancer research, AIDS research, gene mapping, and in vitro fertilization. They were even sent to space to see how human cells react in zero gravity. The list is endless. The number of lives saved and improved because of HeLa cells is incalculable. But while the world of science celebrated this incredible cellular line, the woman behind it was forgotten. Her story was erased. For over 20 years, her family had no idea. The truth finally came crashing down on them in the 1970s when researchers, wanting to do further genetic studies, contacted them for blood samples. It was a bombshell. Imagine learning that your mother, the woman you mourned and missed, had become a cornerstone of modern medicine, and no one had ever told you. The shock turned to anger and a deep sense of injustice. They discovered that scientists and corporations were profiting immensely from their mother's cells, cells that were taken without permission. To make matters worse, researchers published Henrietta's full genetic code online without the family's consent, exposing sensitive health information about her and her descendants to the entire world. This wasn't just a personal family tragedy. It was a glaring example of systemic racism and exploitation in medicine. Henrietta Lacks was a black woman who died in a segregated ward, denied the dignity and choice that should be afforded to every human being. Her story became a symbol of how the contributions of black people have historically been taken, used, and then erased from the narrative. The injustice wasn't just that her cells were taken without consent, but that her identity, her humanity was stripped away, reducing her to a simple 4-letter lab code, HeLa. But the Lacks family refused to let her story remain a footnote. They began to fight back. They started speaking out, demanding that the world know their mother's name. They weren't just fighting for financial compensation. They were fighting for recognition, for justice, for their mother's legacy. Their fight gained momentum as journalists, like Rebecca Skloot, who wrote the best-selling book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Activists and black scholars joined their cause. They forced institutions, universities, and research facilities to confront their complicity in this long history of exploitation. They demanded that Henrietta's name be put back at the center of her own story. The conversation shifted. HeLa was no longer just a cell line. It was a person, a mother, a woman whose contribution deserved to be honored. The pressure built for decades, a slow and steady wave of advocacy that could no longer be ignored. Finally, in 2023, a major breakthrough. The Lacks family reached a landmark settlement with a biotech company that had been profiting from HeLa cells for years. It was the first time a corporation was held financially accountable for the unauthorized, commercial use of Henrietta's cells. It was a victory, a monumental step forward in the fight for bioethics and racial justice in science. But even this victory feels small when you consider the sheer scale of Henrietta's impact. Her legacy is everywhere. It's in the cancer treatments that save our loved ones. It's in the vaccines our children receive. It's in the fundamental understanding of human genetics. Henrietta Lacks is in every corner of modern medicine. She is, without exaggeration, one of the most important figures of the 20th century. She saved millions of lives, but she never got to tell her own story. When we look at her legacy, we are reminded of a powerful and often painful truth. Black people didn't just contribute to medicine. They built its very foundations, often unwillingly, often without credit. Their bodies and their brilliance have been the bedrock of progress, even as the world refused to say their names. Henrietta's story forces us to ask difficult questions about consent, ethics, and who profits from scientific advancement. It is a call to action to ensure that we never again separate scientific discovery from the human beings at its source. We must remember Henrietta Lacks, not as HeLa, but as a vibrant woman whose immortal cells changed the world, and whose family fought tirelessly to restore her name and her dignity. Her story is a testament to the enduring power of a legacy and the importance of fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and, more importantly, subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to telling the stories that have been overlooked, the histories that have been erased. By joining this community, you help us build an archive of truth that can't be silenced. Click that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and stay with us. There are so many more stories to tell. Thank you for watching.
Another chapter reclaimed, another piece of history placed back where it belongs. If you have found any meaning in this, let it sit with you. Let it sharpen your vision, not just for the past, but for who we are becoming. I'm OG Moonie, and this is AI Legacy Lab. Honoring truth, protecting legacy, one story at a time. Until next time, stay curious.